The Evolution of a Goblin to the Peak. Chapter 6, Fighting Kobolds. Although I've just arrived here yesterday, it feels like I haven't eaten seafood for a long time, Sutta muttered as he bit the roasted fish in his hand. He still has a general idea of how to make fire without using magic. I've already increased my intelligence attribute, but I still couldn't remember my past. He looked at his stats while eating. He could only remember that he came from Earth and played the most popular game, Battle World Online. When he first came here, his memory was hazy. He slowly remembers things from the past every time he increases his intelligence attribute. It sucks being a monster with low intelligence. Suddenly, he heard footsteps coming behind him. He slowly turned his head and looked behind him. He saw 5 kobolds coming out of the bushes. They were armed with sword and spear. Shing! The kobolds pointed their weapons on his back. Oi! Oi! Why are you pointing that on me? Do you really want to die that much? One of the kobolds opened its mouth and said something that he couldn't understand. #HDJ379@9. This humanoid dogs? I couldn't understand what they are saying. Sutta frowned hearing this. There's no subtitles or speech balloon in his vision like in the game. If that's really the case, then he wouldn't understand a single thing in this world. No, there's an exception, and that's the undead skeleton mage he fought before. But, it's different as the undead mage talked to his mind directly like some sort of telepathy. Well, he couldn't understand the logic behind it. It seems that he needs to learn the language of this world first. He just hoped that he still has time to learn that. It's important to learn it because he wouldn't be able to converse to other races without learning a language. There's an item that will greatly help him. He recalled one of the most powerful and advanced countries in the world, the Mechanic Country. The Mechanic Country had that technology. A technology where he could freely converse to other people even without knowing their language. That technology could translate thousands of languages around the world. I'll just get it at that time. He muttered as he slowly stood up and faced the kobolds. The kobolds were still saying things that he couldn't understand. The kobolds got fed up with him as he didn't even reply to their question. They raised their weapon and swung it downwards, aiming at his head. Sutta saw this and moved his body sideways, dodging the sharp weapons. He then picked up the Staff of Undead and drew a little distance to the kobolds. It's a fight, right? Okay, I will give you what you want. Saying this, he charged straight on the 5 kobolds in front of him. Clang! 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 Metallic sounds echoed in the area near the river. Sutta ducked down and used his feet to kick the knee of the kobold. He then moved his hand and swung the staff. Clang! One of the kobolds protected its comrades by blocking his staff. Swoosh! The remaining 3 kobolds rushed at him and stabbed their spear in his direction. Seeing this, Sutta rolled backward, avoiding the sharp end of the spears. They have a good combination and I praise that, but that's all. He used dash and quickly zoomed the distance between him and the kobolds. He swung his staff with greater force than before. Bang! One of the kobolds tried to block him but was pushed backward by his strength. The kobolds were pushed back to their comrades. Sutta smirked and he once again used dash. Swoosh! He arrived in front of them in an instant and it caught the kobolds off guard. He raised his feet and swept the kobold in front sideways. Bang! The kobold flew and crashed in the tree, causing the leaves to fall. Sutta followed up by swinging his staff to the kobolds. Bang! The kobolds were hit in the head. It loosened its grip on the sword. Then a heavy foot bent its body before flying a few meters away. He moved his body as he threw his staff on the other kobolds. He then kicked the sword to the air before he jumped and caught it. Put-chi! Blood spurted out from the neck of the kobold. It was so fast that the other 2 kobolds didn't see it clearly. They were shocked that one of them got slain by a mere goblin. There were 5 of them, but they couldn't even handle a single goblin. 2 of them were down and 1 was dead. Only 2 kobolds were left. Sutta landed on the ground and looked at the remaining 2 kobolds with a smirk on his face. When he caught the sword in the air, he quickly used the skill stab, and slain the kobold. You've received 63 EXP for defeating a kobold. There's only 1 system prompts in his head. It means that the other 2 were still alive. They were unconscious. It's time to finish this. Sutta waved the sword and dashed towards the 2 kobolds. You've received 67 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 49 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 54 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 55 EXP for defeating a kobold. Series of prompts ringed inside his head. Sutta cleaned the bloodstains on his body in the river. He also cleaned the sword that he will use. He just recalled that this river was near the dungeon of kobolds. It's not that surprising that he met them here, as he already guesses it before. If this was the same as the game, then it's really shocking to see the monster inside the dungeon walking out of it. Should I go there? He rubbed his chin and looked at his reflection on the water. Probably not. The monsters inside the low-level dungeon were 30 to 50. But it's different now. The kobolds could increase their numbers by breeding. So the monsters inside the dungeon were higher than 50. He wouldn't be able to conquer it with his condition. It's possible if he finishes his first evolution. That's it. He decided that he will increase his level first by conquering the other 6 dungeons where undead lives. No, it's 5 now, as he already conquered the first one. He rubbed his chin as he tried to recall a dungeon that has a lot of loots that could bring him benefits. After a few minutes of thinking, he decided that he would go to the dungeon where ghouls reside. By the looks of it, it seems that he doesn't need to go to the surface to get the basic class needs. There's no other treasure inside the dungeon before, because there's a secret room there where one could find the universal treasure, Soul Blood Earring. But it's different from other dungeon. He could find skill books and knowledge there. Back then, some players even found spirit fruit. Speaking of loots, the upper floor couldn't be compared to what's on the middle floor. The loots there were abundant, and all of these were free to take. He doesn't have any competitor here cause he's the only one here beside the monsters. Oh. He's also a monster. Sudha stood up and hanged the undead's robe on his shoulder. On his left hand, there's the sword, and the staff was on his right hand. Okay, let's conquer and evolve as fast as we can, Sudha shouted, even though he's the only one here. Put chi. A dog head flew in the air and sprayed blood on the area below. I forgot that I'm close to the kobold's dungeon. Sudha sighed and gripped his weapon tightly. He used dash and crashed the enemies in front of him, giving him a bunch of EXP. He didn't show any mercy to these kobolds that want to take his life. He killed them as if he was harvesting EXP, just like in the game. Blood flow on the ground, and it turned the green grasses into crimson blood color. Today, the kobolds lost 10 men. Who, it really leaves a bad taste in my mouth, Sudha said as he turned around and left the scene. Sinking a sharp blade into the flesh of a living being made him feel nausea. This was not a game anymore that he could ignore killing them. It's a different feeling when he's killing the undead as those were originally dead. He rested the staff on his shoulder as he walked leisurely towards the direction of the ghoul's dungeon. After a few minutes of walking, he arrived in front of a dark cave. The dark cave was releasing a very dark aura. It was like he was back inside the skeleton's dungeon. The only difference was this dungeon was releasing a stinky smell. It stinks here. Sudha frowned as he pinched his nose. The ghouls were rotten creatures. It's different from skeleton soldiers that don't have any piece of flesh. These ghouls' smell was really bad as its flesh was rotten, and there's even a worm crawling inside their body. That's what he remembered inside the game. His knowledge of the game was really helpful to him. Well, let's go inside now. Sudha took a step forward and entered the cave. The evolution of a goblin to the peak. Chapter 7, Sealed Door. Good. Sudha looked at his stats and nodded. His health, mana, and stamina were full. He loses too much health and stamina in the battle yesterday. When someone was not resting, a player's ordinary recovery rate was 1 per hour, but when they're sleeping their recovery would increase by 5 times. In other words, it would become 5 per hour. He only had 42 health, so 8 hours of sleep were enough to get his health back to full. It's also the reason why some of the players will choose to go to an inn before they log out. Players wouldn't be able to move once they choose to activate the function sleep in the game, that's why they have to log out. Well, let's enter. Sudha shook his head and stepped inside the cave. This dungeon was different from the last dungeon. The floor, walls, and ceiling were made of stone bricks. It looks like an abandoned underground base or labyrinths. The torches on the wall were organized neatly so Sudha could see more clearly in this place. Sudha looked 10 meters away from him. 5 ghouls were standing there without doing anything. He could clearly see their rotten flesh. He brandished his sword and dashed forward. Swoosh! Die! He roared as he waved his sword. The head of the ghouls flew and crashed in the ceiling. Thick blood scattered everywhere. Sudha ignored this and he kicked the body of the ghoul that he beheaded. Bang! The headless ghoul crashed on the 2 ghouls on the left side. It immobilized the 2 ghouls. The other 2 ghouls roared as they charged at him. Sudha pulled back his sword and used the skill, stab, put chi. The sword pierced through the body of the ghoul. He lifted up his feet and kicked the ghoul, at the same time pulling out his sword. He then moved his other hand and swung the staff. Bang! He didn't stop as he swung his sword again. Die! It took him a minute before he defeated the 5 ghouls. With his current stats, he could defeat these monsters without any problem. Sudha looked at the paths in front of him. He frowned as he tried to recall where's the boss room. Ah! I remember now. It's in the front. Since the boss was on the path ahead, he decided to finish the left path first. He's saving the boss for the last. That's really the way. He would get the other good things here before fighting the boss. The things on the left path were a treasure containing skill books that he needs to get a class. While the right path was a room full of more than 20 ghouls. Even though he knew that the right path was a room full of ghouls, he would still enter it as he needed EXP and soul the most right now. He wouldn't let it escape his grasp. Those EXP and soul were all his possession. Not now, maybe later after he kills them. The basic requirements to get the class. He moved forward and killed some of the ghouls on his way until he reached a sealed metal door. He was familiar with this door. A sealed door where treasure chest lies behind it. Characters were neatly carved in the metal door. Below the characters were things that he knew. A coin, book, fish, and a bed. He couldn't understand the meaning of these characters. I really need to learn how to read and write in this world, Suda muttered with a sigh. If he wasn't familiar with this dungeon, then he wouldn't be able to get the treasure inside this sealed door. If he was in the game, the system would translate these words for him. He sighed with a helpless expression. He then rubbed his chin as he began to delve back into his memories. Some parts of his memories were fuzzy, covered with thick fog. After a few minutes, he opened his eyes and looked at the characters. If I'm not wrong, these characters. It means, it wears a coat to keep its skins in working order. Transport you to other realms without a magic portal. That's what he found in his memories. It's strange that he could look back in his memories like a book. If I were to answer this back on Earth, then I would answer virtual capsule, but it's not in the choices below. Well, I know the answer because I already tried this back then. He stepped forward and pressed the book on the door. He then took a step backward as he waited for the door to open. After a few seconds, he heard a metallic sound stirring inside the door before it slowly opened. It revealed a dark room without any torches. Suda smirked as he looked inside the dark room. If he picked the wrong answer, then it would activate a trap to kill him. He died many times because of the trap back in the game. He took a step inside the dark room. A golden treasure chest was laying in the middle of the room. The darkness couldn't hide the golden treasure chest completely. He squatted down and slowly opened the golden treasure chest. Inside the chest were 2 black books. These 2 black books were the skill books that he wanted to acquire. He could also get these books in the academy on the surface or some mysterious guy that sells skill books. Well, there were many ways to get the basic skill required for basic class, and going into the dungeon was one of these. Suda held it in his hands. A row of words appeared in his vision as soon as he touched the books. Do you want to learn mana manipulation skill for 2 skill points? Yes/no. Do you want to learn fireball spell for 2 skill points? Yes/no. He had 8 skill points and learning these 2 skills would leave him 4 skill points. He received 1 skill point every time he levels up, and 4 skill points weren't a loss to him if he could learn these 2 skills. Yes, Suda said mentally. He then saw his skill points decreased by 4. Knowledge about the 2 skills was poured inside his head. It made him slightly lose his balance. You've learned mana manipulation skill. You've learned fireball spell. Suda took a deep breath when he read the words. He's 1 step closer before he could get a class. The requirements for the mage class were simple. A player needs to learn the skill, mana manipulation, and 5 magic spells for the class mage. He already learned 1 magic spell. He just needs to learn 4 more spells to complete the requirements to mage class, but that wasn't important now. What bothered him was the strange feeling when he learned the skills. The knowledge of the skills that were poured in his head. Suda raised his hand and it emitted a dim bluish light. He could somehow control the mana inside his body. There's no function like this in the game. The players thought that mana manipulation skill were useless. For them, and him, this skill was only a requirement to get the class mage and learn other spells. The feeling of this strange energy inside his body made him felt like nothing could defeat him. He could freely control the mana inside his body. He could use it to coat his fist, legs, or his whole body when fighting an opponent. Really? This is making me excited, he said with a grin on his face. He's looking forward to going to the surface. After he finished settling his things, he went back and go to the crossing paths before. He finished the left path and time to exterminate the ghouls on the right path. First, he looked at his newly acquired skills. Mana manipulation, level 1, a skill that will let you control your mana. No cost. Fireball, level 1, creates a fireball that attacks the enemy. Mana cost, 5. These were enough for him. Undead was weak against fire, light, and holy type skills. This lessens the difficulty of this dungeon. No, the boss. He wouldn't use the fireball against ordinary ghouls as he only had 36 mana. He would save it to finish the boss easier. At the very least, he wouldn't suffer like when he fought the undead skeleton mage before. He had a higher chance of beating a boss with additional fire type skills. He hummed as he walked forward. He was in a good mood right now. There's no doubt about this, but the other dungeons contain skill books. He would plunder them later and get the mage class. After a few minutes of walking, he arrived in the center of a wide room. Bang! The only exit behind him was closed and the walls slowly opened, revealing a large number of ghouls inside. Grah! The ghouls looked at him with bloodshot eyes. They revealed their sharp nails and teeth. Shying, Sutta brandished his sword as he slowly turned around to face the ghouls. He smirked and said, "Don't disappoint me. Just give me a lot of EXP. The evolution of a goblin to the peak. Chapter 8, Boss Battle. Sutta turned his body in the air while slashing his sword. Put chi. The heads of the ghouls fell on the ground with a loud thud sound. Sutta landed and he quickly moved his body around the wide room. He didn't get too close to the walls as he knows that there's a trap there. If he gets 1 meter close to the walls he will activate the trap. The walls, ceiling, and floors will sprout metallic spike that could kill him easily. Sutta swiftly moved his body as he avoided the ghouls from all sides. Swyish. He cut the arms the ghouls in front of him before he swept it with his staff. Bang! 10 down. With every wave of his hand, parts of ghouls flew in the air. He cleanly cut their bodies into 2 before smashing it with his staff. He crushed the ghouls brutally without a hint of mercy. He slashed his sword until he cut them down. In just 10 minutes, he finished all the 28 ghouls. He sat down on the ground while panting heavily. Fighting almost 30 ghouls cost him large amount of stamina. He even took some scratches on his body. "I'll rest for an hour," Sutta muttered as he lied down on his back. He looked at the ceiling with a blank expression. Growling, the door slowly opened as the ground shook slightly. It revealed a path to go back to the entrance. Huff. Just 20 more souls and I will be able to use the effect of Soul Blood Earring. Sutta muttered while looking at the interface in front of him. Just a little bit more and he will be able to increase one of his attributes using the effect of his earring. The effect of Soul Blood Earring was permanent, so even if he unequip it his stats will stay the same. When you're a goblin it doesn't matter if you level up or not, what matters was the evolution. The attributes only increased by 1 and it didn't even make a difference in powers. Sutta wiped his sweat using the Undead's robe. He doesn't have an inventory so he couldn't store the equipment he found in this dungeon. I will be fighting the boss soon. He recalled that the boss here was the Great Undead Summoner. A boss-type ghoul that could summon tens of ghouls in an instant. He guessed that this will be enough for his Soul Blood Earring. He will also level up to 8 if he could kill 5 or more ghouls. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. He dreamed that he was Blood, fighting hundreds of enemies in the near Great War. He woke up after 3 hours of sleep. He sat on the ground and rubbed his eyes. I fell asleep. He looked at his surroundings and found that he was still in the dungeon. How careless of him to sleep in a dungeon full of ghouls. He stood up while grabbing his weapons, the staff, and the sword. He then exited the room after he finished checking his condition. He arrived at the intersection and went to the path where the boss lies. He just checked his stats and this was enough for him. Soon, he met 5 ghouls. He didn't hesitate as he directly charged ahead while brandishing his sword. Finished the battle in an instant. Do not waste stamina. Put chi. The heads of the ghouls flew in the air as their bodies stopped moving. Sutta turned his head and looked at the body of the ghouls. He then waved his sword and the blood on it splattered on the ground. Just a little bit more and I will level up. He walked ahead and found a huge metal door. A boss room, He placed his palm on the door, feeling the cold metallic surface of the door. He put more force in his hand and pushed the door open. Swoosh. Cold wind burst out of the room. It brushed his face and felt a chill on his body. It's cold here. He muttered and looked at the robe that was hanging on his shoulder. Placing down the staff, he grabbed the robe and wrapped it on his body. Okay, let's do this. Sutta took a deep breath and said to himself. He unconsciously emitted a faint killing intent as he stepped inside the room. The room was so wide. It's circular like the room of the undead skeleton mage. There were no torches on the walls as it was covered in ice. On the ceiling, there's a crystal that gives off light. Sutta saw the figure of a 2.5 meter ghoul in the center of the room. Below its feet, a large magic circle was drawn on the ground. The magic circle was emitting a faint white light. It was the boss of this dungeon, the Great Undead Summoner, another long-range boss. He muttered while looking on the gigantic ghoul. He could feel the dense mana in this room. After learning the mana manipulation skill, he became sensitive to the mana in his surrounding. The boss moved its head and looked at him deeply. It then roared loudly that shook the entire room. Roar. Sutta smirked as he saw 7 ordinary ghouls emerge from the ground. An EXP pot, He bent his knees and threw himself on the ghouls. Boom. In just a second, he arrived in front of the ghouls. He used stab and pierced the body of the ghoul. He didn't stop as he headed to the next ghoul and smashed it using his staff. Bang. The boss took a deep breath and Sutta noticed it. Sutta quickly rolled sideways as the boss used its own skill. Air wave. A powerful gust of wind that could tear Sutta's flesh shot out from the mouth of the boss. The wind didn't hit anything before it crashed in the walls, causing it to shake a few times. What a powerful skill. Sutta said in a low voice while looking at the damage it caused. He then turned his head and looked at the boss with a smile on his face. Ding! Quest triggered. Boss fight. Defeat the dungeon boss and conquer the dungeon. Rewards: 400 EXP, 1 attribute point, and 1 skill point. Sota read the quest with a smile on his face. He turned to the ordinary ghouls and used dash. He quickly kills one of the ghouls before jumping in the air. He could see that there were another 7 ghouls emerging from the ground. He opened his palm and shoot, fireball. Bang! You're not the only one who has skills. Saying this, Sota aimed his sword downwards as he fell down while piercing the head of the ghoul. He quickly stood up as the rest of the ghouls were rushing at him. This was the strategy of this boss. While the boss was charging the air wave, the ordinary ghouls were going to rush at its enemy. Summoning, air wave, and berserk ice shot were the skills of this boss. Once a player grasped the boss's fighting style, they could eliminate it easily. He runs in circles while slashing the ghouls. He kept moving his arms as he just slashed and smashed everything in front of him. Then, he heard a familiar sound in his head. Ding! You've level up. All attributes increased by 1. You've received 1 skill point. You've received 2 free attribute points. Level 8, huh? He thought as he jumped in the air and barely avoided the air wave. He used the head of the ghouls to run before jumping towards the boss. He slashed his sword on the back of the boss. Swyish. The boss grew angrier as it threw him rapid punches. Sota jumped side to side, barely dodging the punches of the boss. He shot, fireball, once again, and it hit the face of the boss. Sota turned around and left the boss. He proceeded to kill the ordinary ghouls. Ding! You've collected 100 souls. He heard a system prompts on his head. He looked and saw that he collected 100 souls. When he was about to use the souls he collected, the boss used the most powerful skills in its arsenal. Berserk ice shot. Ice blocks with the size of a human head kept coming straight at him. Bang! 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 Sota got hit on his shoulder and stomach. Arg! He gritted his teeth as he used the 100 souls to increase his agility attribute by 10. Ding! You've used the soul you've collected. Agility increased by 10. Sota felt cold energy entered his body and it increased his ability. Agility, 23. This will be enough. He took a deep breath while checking his attribute and, swoosh, he disappeared from his position and appeared 10 meters away. He moved so fast that the ghouls couldn't even see him. He turned around him, used stab, repeatedly, piercing all the bodies of the ghouls. The boss grew angrier at this. It once again cast air wave as berserk ice shot was cooling down. A powerful gust of wind went straight forward on Sota. Sota turned his head and looked at the incoming powerful wind. When the powerful wind was about to hit him, he once again vanished. The boss was stunned at this. It then noticed that Sota was running. Dash. Sota increased his speed with the skill, dash. When he was 10 meters away from the boss, he jumped in the air and used stab on the face of the boss. Roar. The boss roared and waved its hand. Sota maneuvered himself in the air and landed in the ghoul's hand. Fireball. The fireball exploded in the face of the boss. Sota followed up by stabbing his sword. Stab. Ding. Proficiency reached. Your skill stab level up to 2. Sota was surprised when he saw the system prompts. He didn't think that he would be able to level up his skill in just 2 days. Normally, it would take a week or 2 to level up a level 1 skill to 2 without using skill points. Luck is on my side. He smirked as he used the strengthened stab. Put chi. Dark red blood gushed out from the neck of the boss. Die. Sota roared as he used fireball until he ran out of mana. Bang! 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 All of the fireballs hit the head of the boss. The head of the boss was covered in thick gray smoke. Thud! Sota landed in front of the boss and waved his sword and staff. Just die. He waved the 2 weapons in his hands trying to kill the boss. In just a minute, he threw more than 100 blows. For the final phase. Sota pulled back his sword before stabbing it madly. Stab. Ding. You've received 1,830 EXP for defeating the great undead summoner. Sota breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the system prompt. Then, he was filled with bewilderment. He hasn't finished the mission. He already killed the boss. Soon, he found the answer as he heard a low growl behind him. The ghouls were still here. He wouldn't be able to complete the mission until he kills all of them. He turned around with a tired expression as he faced the ghouls. I need to make it quick. I want to rest. The evolution of a goblin to the peak. Chapter 9, Kobold again. Congratulations on completing the boss fight mission. You've received 400 EXP. You've received 1 attribute point. You've received 1 skill point. Sota lied down after he heard the system prompts. Fighting the boss and ghouls at the same time took almost all of his stamina. Plus, he also drained his mana pool. He only had 1 mana reserved in his mana pool. Well, he also gains a lot this time. Unfortunately, the ghouls weren't wearing any sort of armor, so he couldn't pick any decent items from their body. Well played, Suda, he said to himself as he looked at his stats. Name, Suda Yeshi. Race, Goblin. Level, 8, 2, 725/3, 500. Class, None. Health, 29 44ths. Stamina, March 22nd. Mana, 1 of 38. Strength, 27, 17 plus 10, plus. Agility, 23, plus. Dexterity, 10, plus. Intelligence, 19, 9 plus 10, plus. Vitality, 22, 12 plus 10, plus. Free attribute points, 8. Skills, Dash, Stab, Sword Mastery, Mana Manipulation. Spells, Fireball. Equipment skills, Harvester of the Soul. Soul collected, 18/200. Skill points, 6. He used the souls he collected to increase his agility attribute. Right now, all of his stats were balanced except the dexterity. Dexterity and agility were somehow connected, as he wouldn't be able to control his speed properly without raising his dexterity. Harvester of the Soul. This skill was a cheat. It's one of the reasons that he got stronger in the past. The souls that he needs to use the effect of the skill got higher. Currently, 200 souls were what he needed. To get this amount, he needs to at least conquer 1 or 2 dungeons. There were many opportunities to obtain souls in this world. There's no shortage of war in this world. Just by standing in the middle of a battlefield, he could get thousands of souls in just a few seconds. A small war was participated by 2 countries. And the battlefield of this war was enough for him to increase his stats by a few times. Hundreds of thousands of people participated in a war of this scale. Back then, the players gave him a nickname, Wanderer of War. It was because he always appeared on different battlefields around the world plundering the souls of the dead people. It was especially in the Great War where all countries joined the battle. There were at least billions of souls there. He walked throughout the whole continents. Nothing could stop him at that time. Suda put those memories in the back of his head. He then looked at his stats once again. Just a little bit EXP and he's going to level up once again. He's slowly reaching the level cap before evolution, and his stats weren't enough for the requirements. It seems that he needs to use his free attribute points to raise his stats. Suda closed his eyes and pondered what he should do next. After getting out in this sanctuary, he will try to determine what version he's currently. There's a probability that the future he knows was different. There's a reason for that, and that's because of the existence of players. Every day millions of players were doing an ordinary quest, and some of them were doing hidden quest or main quest. Sometimes, it could determine the future of a kingdom. There was once a war between 2 countries and 5 of the top 10 guilds joined one side. The outcome was inevitable. The side that the player joined won the war. While thinking this, Suda fell asleep because of tiredness. Suda woke up after sleeping for almost 8 hours. He yawned and stretched his body before he got up. He, the legendary player of Battle World Online, start his day in another world. I want to wash my body. He looked at himself full of dirt. He exited the dungeon and sneakily went to the river to wash. On his way, he met the corpses of both kobolds and goblins. He sat down and checked the body of the goblin. It seems that they were killed recently. Suda muttered as he stood up. The souls were still here, so they didn't die that long. The souls will leave the body after 3 hours, so he could guess what happened here. It only means that the kobolds and goblins engaged in a battle based on their wounds and the surrounding. The battle was not small at all. At least it involves half of the force of a whole dungeon. He could see it because there were 15 dead bodies here, not including the kobolds. If he added it, then there's a total of 26 dead bodies here. I want to relax for a while, but it seems that I don't have the time, Suda said in a low voice as he turned his head to look at his left side. This was the direction of the dungeons where Goblin and Kobold lives. He collected the souls of the kobolds and goblins before he left. Clang, clang, the kobolds and goblins were fighting. It was a large-scale battle involving 20 monsters. It looks like the battle already starts half an hour ago because of the corpse scattered on the ground. Suda was looking down on the battle on top of the tree. He could predict the outcome of this battle. The kobolds were pushing the goblins. He waved his hand and collected the souls of the dead. He easily collected more than 50 souls this time. He guessed that it's time to increase his EXP. He couldn't just watch everything while collecting souls leisurely. He also needs the EXP to level up. He opened his stats and looked over. His health, stamina, and mana were full. He would use a little bit of his stamina to kill all the kobolds this time. He didn't hesitate anymore as he directly jumped in the air towards the battle. He brandished his sword and stabbed it on one of the kobolds. The kobolds and goblins were startled at his sudden appearance. You've received 46 EXP for defeating a kobold. Suda smirked and threw himself towards the kobolds. He didn't give them the time to regain their composure as he sliced one of the kobolds in half. Put chi. The leading kobold roared angrily and shouted on its comrades. The rest of the kobolds came back to their senses. Sutta slashed his sword on the leading kobold. The leading kobold held its spear tightly and blocked the sword aiming at its neck. The two exchanged blows causing sparks to flew around them. Clang! 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 Sutta took a step back as he was quite surprised at the spear skill of the kobold in front of him. At least level 2 mastery, huh? He thought. The kobold in front of him had a higher mastery of weapon than him. He once again clashed against the leading kobold. Clang! 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 Sutta waved his sword faster than before. He also out more strength. He would dominate the kobold in front of him with his high stats. Clang! 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 In just a few seconds, the two exchanged dozens of blows. Cracked. Sutta's sword was shattered and the leading kobold smiled at this. Sutta opened his palm and the handle of the sword slipped off. The kobold felt something was wrong but it couldn't figure out what's wrong. Sutta slightly opened his mouth and said, "Fireball." Flame burst out of his palm and exploded in the face of the kobold. Boom! The kobold couldn't dodge it as their distance to each other was 1 foot. It was impossible to dodge with its stats. Sutta already knew that the sword was on the verge of the collapse before the battle. He could see the details of his equipment he registered in his system as equip, so he could that the durability of the weapon he uses. Sutta clenched his fist tightly and threw a powerful punch on the stomach of the kobold. Bang! He threw another punch on the face and hurriedly picked a sword on the ground. Stab! The sword pierced the neck of the kobold. It quickly drained its life and drew its last breath before falling on the ground. You've received 118 EXP for defeating a kobold warrior. Sutta was surprised when he saw the words, kobold warrior. So this kobold wasn't ordinary kobold, that's why it could exchange blows with him for a long time. The level 2, spear mastery, was great. It could suppress his skills like that. If not for his scheme he wouldn't be able to kill it with just his level 1, sword mastery. Sutta hurriedly shook his head. It's not the time to think about that. There's still kobolds left here and he needs to kill them first. Sutta killed the rest of the kobolds easily. He waved his hand and collected the souls of the dead. He then turned his head to the goblin in front of him. The goblin was saying something he couldn't understand. What the hell? I don't understand what this guy's saying. Sutta thought while looking on the goblin that kept blabbering something he doesn't understand. Should he kill them? No, they're important to reduce the numbers of the kobolds and the other inhabitants of the dungeon here. The numbers of the living creature here were greater than it was in the game. The kobolds that died this time were greater than 50. He recalled that he collected only 30 souls back in the first dungeon, the Dungeon of Skeletons. If he was chased by huge numbers of monsters with his current state then he could only flee on the surface. Sutta frowned and looked at the goblin in front of him. He will let them fight the kobolds until the kobolds took heavy casualties. It was then that he will strike. He guesses that it happened because he killed those 10 kobolds yesterday. Since he couldn't converse with them, Sutta decided to leave now. There's no point in staying here. He turned around and leave the place quickly with his skill, dash. He was going to check the situation of the other dungeons, especially the orcs. They were the ones with the most power here on the upper floor of the sanctuary. The evolution of a goblin to the peak. Chapter 10, Evolve Kobolds. In just a few minutes, Sutta arrived in the area near the orcs' dungeon. The orcs were the most powerful monsters here in the upper floor of the sanctuary. Their stats were naturally higher than the other monsters of the same level. Pure strength. They only use their brute strength in a fight. They don't have any skills at all, but it's different to an evolve orc. The evolve orc have higher stats and could use skills. The combat power of the boss of this dungeon was higher than anything else on the upper floor. Even he wouldn't dare to enter that dungeon with his current stats. Sutta was hiding on the top of a tree. He was observing the dungeon carefully. 3 orcs came out of the cave. The orcs had huge bodies. They were 3 meters tall and have bodies full of fat. They were armed with a huge butcher knife. They were literally what people called pig head. Sutta felt that they were oozing out power greater than kobolds and goblins. 1 orc could fight 3 goblins on the same level. Still, hunting in a pack, huh? He thought as he saw the 3 orcs entered the woods. They were probably going to hunt foods here. The orcs weren't moving suspiciously and it seemed that they only hunt the wolves from the other dungeon. There's no war going on in this place and they didn't try to invade the other dungeons. Good boy. Sutta muttered and then continued observing for half an hour. When he confirmed that there's nothing wrong, he turned around and left. He also checked the other dungeons this time. The Hornet and Slime's dungeon were still silent. They didn't even come out of their base. After that, he came back to the kobold's dungeon. He waited in the tree and half an hour later 5 kobolds came out of the dungeon. Sudha silently moved his body and he followed behind the 5 kobolds. 10 minutes later, he saw an opportunity. He quickly jumped out of the bushes and sliced the neck of the kobold. You've received 61 EXP for defeating a kobold. 1 down. Sudha smirked and turned his head to the remaining 4 kobolds. They kobolds clenched their weapon and charged straight. TCH. Sudha faced them as he moved the sword in his hand faster than anyone present here. Stab. Stab. Put chi. Put chi. The 4 kobolds stopped charging. They stood silently and looked on their chest. They saw a small hole on their left chest. Spat. Blood flowed down in their mouth and they fell on their ground without any signs of life. You've received 48 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 55 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 66 EXP for defeating a kobold. You've received 53 EXP for defeating a kobold. Sudha made a hole in their chest using his skill. Now that stab reached level 2, it was now faster and stronger than before. A single stab could kill 2 kobolds easily. The only problem was that it consumed 2 stamina per use. He checked his EXP percentage and found that he was about to level up once again. If he could conquer the kobold's dungeon, then he would reach the level requirements of the first evolution. He would also gain enough souls to increase his stats. Evolution, huh? He quite interested in his evolution and he wasn't going to deny it. After all, his character in the game was a demi. A demi doesn't have any evolution like monsters. They were already born stronger than the monster like goblins, kobolds, slimes, etc. If his character was demi or human, then he already cleaned up the upper floor in this sanctuary. He wanted to experience the effect of evolution. According to the players, the effect of evolution was great. Their powers wouldn't increase twice but thrice. It's not a simple increase in stats. With a wave of his hand, he collected the souls of the kobolds and left the scene. One day had passed quickly. The battle between kobolds and goblins were heating up. The casualties on 2 sides could amount to 100 men. Sudha collected all the souls and increased his strength attribute. He killed some of the kobolds that left the dungeon. This let him reach level 9 easier. Now, he needs 5,600 EXP to level up to 10. Kobolds were not enough, he also needs the goblin here or the other monsters. He needs the soul of the goblins and kobolds to reach the requirements in evolution. He was quite surprised at the numbers of the kobolds. He estimated that their total number was higher than 200. This number gave him a surprise. This surpassed the numbers of what a low-level dungeon could hold. But what surprised him the most were the goblins. The number of goblins exceeded the number of kobolds. As expected of a goblin, their fertility rate was higher than any normal monster. The only problem was they were not that of a great fighter. Right now, the forces of kobolds and goblins were fighting in front of him. More than 100 monsters participated in this battle. Clang! 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 Sounds of swords clashing echoed in the whole area. The numbers of goblins were greater than the kobolds, but the kobolds' fighting abilities were higher. What a great battle! Sudha observed the surroundings while fighting some kobolds. He's taking it easy. He didn't reveal his abilities here as he just wants to plunder the souls here. Sometimes he would kill goblins and kobolds sneakily. He's slowly increasing his EXP and souls here. Clang! 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 Sudha crossed swords in one of the kobolds. He then looked around before he slashed the neck of the kobold. Put chi. You've received 67 EXP for defeating a kobold. He moved to another kobold and killed it. You've received 52 EXP for defeating a kobold. It's enough. Sudha muttered as he silently left the battlefield without anyone knowing. It's time to visit the kobold's dungeon. Sudha ran past in the woods and arrived in front of the kobold's dungeon. He saw 20 kobolds leaving the dungeon. They were armed with a sharp weapon. What caught his attention were the 4 kobolds in front of the group. The 4 kobolds were emitting a very extraordinary aura that no ordinary kobolds could emit. An evolved kobolds. Sudha muttered under his breath. The 4 were evolved kobolds. They were much difficult opponents than ordinary kobolds, but they were still at the early stage of first evolution. Sudha squinted his eyes. If he could see their levels, they were probably between 11 and 14. 15 and 20 were the levels of the low-level dungeon. Huff. Sudha took a deep breath and gripped his sword tightly. He also took out his staff and he slowly bent his knees. He was going to take out 1 or 2 in an instant to decrease his burden in fighting them all at the same time. Boom! Sudha's speed was so fast that he arrived in front of the group in an instant. He moved his hand and his sword flew, slicing the neck of the evolved kobold. Put chi. You've received 174 EXP for defeating a high kobold. The kobolds were surprised. They couldn't react at all as Suta's sword sliced one of their comrades. He then smashed his sword on the kobold on his left side. Before they could regain their composure, Suta killed another kobold. Roar! One of the evolved kobold roared angrily at him. It slashed its sword on him. Clang! Suta blocked it using the staff. He felt the force of the kobold behind the attack. He was surprised that they were equals in strength. Damn! He jumped backward as he saw that the other two evolved kobolds rushed at him. Swyish! He threw his staff in the midair and opened his palm widely. He fired 3 fireballs consecutively. Bang! 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 The fireballs exploded in front of the 2 evolved kobolds. Suta used this chance and killed 2 ordinary kobolds swiftly. He ignored the system prompts in his mind as he turned around and left, growling. The 3 evolved kobolds growled angrily and started to chase him. Suta entered the woods faster using dash. He then hit his body on the top of the tree. It was hard to spot him in the tree because of the color of his skin. The EXP he received from killing a high kobold was high. He would get more than 500 EXP if he killed the remaining 3 high kobolds. Swoosh! Swoosh! Suta turned his head when he heard the sound of moving fast like a wind. He saw the kobolds went straight to the direction of the battlefield. Hey! He raised his sword above his head and threw it towards the kobolds. Swyish! A kobold turned its head and it felt a strange sensation in its chest. A sword pierced its chest. The kobold looked up and saw Suta charging straight. Good! Suta grabbed the handle of the sword and kicked the body of the kobold, pulling out the sword from its chest. He then turned around and used dash. The ordinary kobolds couldn't follow him. Only the 3 evolved kobolds could react to his speed. Before they could stop him, Suta already sliced the neck of the ordinary kobolds. He a series of sound in his head. Grah! The 3 kobolds threw themselves at him and slashed their weapon. Suta slightly shifted his body as a spear passed beside him. He then waved his sword to the attacks of the 2 evolved kobolds. Clang! Come! Suta moved his faster and clashed against the evolved kobolds. Clang! 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 Suta didn't back down at all, even he took some deep cuts on his body. He fought with all of his strength. He forced the 2 evolved kobolds away and grabbed the sword of the other evolved kobold which was aimed at his head. Arg! Blood flows out of his hand when he grabbed the blade of the sword. Suta smirked and said, "Gotcha." He then used stab 2 times and made a hole on the body of the evolved kobolds. You've received 181 EXP for defeating a high kobold. Before he could turn to look at the other kobold, a spear pierced his left shoulder. Arg! Suta groaned from the pain he felt. Lifting up his left hand, he forcefully grabbed the spear on his shoulder before he threw his sword on the other kobold. He then turned his head to the kobold who stabbed his shoulder. He grabbed tightly the spear and didn't let it go even when the kobold pulled it away. Suta opened his palm widely and grabbed the face of the kobold. He cast fireball consecutively until he heard the system prompts. He then released his grip on the face of the kobold. He pulled out the spear on his shoulder and jumped in the midair. Swoosh! He looked down and saw the remaining kobold looking at him with fear. Once you start to feel it, you're bound to lose, Suta said before putting his strength on his arm before forcefully throwing the spear. The spear traveled in the air going straight towards the kobold. Swoosh! The spear nailed the kobold on the ground. It drew its last brew looking at Suta. You've received 192 EXP from defeating a high kobold. Suta sat down on the grass. He lost 1/4 of his health from this battle. He could actually end it faster if he uses stab, but he wants to reserve it because he was going to fight the boss today. He rested for a few minutes and left after collecting the souls.